So making available has two main elements to it. It's an electronic transmission, and members of the public have to access it from a time and a place chosen by them. The European directive gave everyone a choice of how to implement making available. They said that you could either implement it as a performer remuneration right, or you could implement it as an exclusive right. And I think due to the nature of downloads and how similar they were with CDs, it was implemented as an exclusive right. So then, when that happened, the labels subsumed that right into the contracts as part of that bunch of performer rights that's in there. And then they started fitting it in with the constructs of the way CDs were treated. In the last few years, this has brought up a few issues, particularly the very real problem of default ownership of the making available right, because there are many contracts obviously in existence before making available had even been invented and was implemented in 2001. So in the contracts that were signed before then, there were clauses that were these all-catchment, all-encompassing clauses that covered all rights that existed now and in the future. So the labels, I think, took that right, that clause, and subsumed making available under that clause and took assumed ownership of it. So streaming's been a huge area of growth for the music industry, and hundreds of new services have now appeared, as we all know. And the different business models that exist all have different levels of interactivity within them. We love personalised radio, and we have lots of it. The difference here is that it's embedded in on-demand streaming platforms. We see it everywhere. And the fact is that these separate features within on-demand streaming platforms are not licensed differently. They're all licensed under reproduction and making available. So this starts to highlight some of the ambiguity when applying the language of making available. So when it comes to personalised radio, random tracks, automatically generated playlists, or even just playlists on random, you could question whether all the recordings are accessed from a time and a place chosen by the user. Currently, the interpretation of UK law is that yes, it is. Whether the user knows what's coming or not, it's still making available. They still initiated the transmission. But some argue that communication to the public should kick in after a few tracks have played on a personalised radio service. It's also worth noting here that the European Commission recommends that communication to the public is applied to near on-demand services, but we don't know really what that means. There's no technical definition for it, so it hasn't been done. So looking to the future, we've all seen, I think, on numerous occasions that when a format takes off, others around it suffer. But I think for the first time, there's something in our industry that is under threat for the first time, and I think that's potentially radio, because we are in an age of on-demand, and it's likely that radio listeners will also move across into the on-demand streaming sector. The sophistication of radio-style products that exist online are becoming better and better. They're now including unique content, they're including talking segments and interviews, and really starting to compete in this space. Not only this, but now these services are also being used in very public places like shops and hairdressers and bars, and replacing the traditional radio model there. So we could say that it's inevitable that direct income generated from communication and public performance is probably on its way down. So in other words, all the music that's played in shops and to some extent traditional radio, they're likely to be replaced at some point by a form of interactive streaming. And we've discussed already that performer ER doesn't apply to this at all. So it's likely that stable income for session musicians and featured artists who haven't recouped from their contracts is under a big threat.
When I first went to work for the Musicians' Union, I was the careers advisor. And at that time, that was before there was equitable remuneration for public performance and broadcast for performers. And I actually had quite a lot of acts that at that time had been on the front page of the NME or the Melody Maker come and see me and say, do you know what, we just can't afford to have record deals anymore. Because they'd signed exclusive contracts to record companies, so they couldn't work for any other record companies. They weren't all writers necessarily, maybe one or two of them were, but there was just what we used to call in the old days sidemen, which is terribly sexist now, but I suppose side musicians, if you like, who, they relied on income from their recordings. This was during a time when money from live work really wasn't there. This is pre the festival boom. And I don't mind sort of being honest and saying, there was some really big acts in terms of, indie acts who just said, we don't know what to do. Our advance paid for our recordings to be made and paid off a few debts. And, we're a little way in. We've got some profile. People know about us. We've played on the radio. But there's no money from the record company. And we're looking at ending the first year and needing to borrow more money from the record company. So the point of this story is that when equitable remuneration came in and became a source of income for musicians, it was a lifeline. It was a lifeline to all those bands that were never ever going to recoup on their labels. And let's just pause for a second, because when the record companies say, we don't make much money, half our bands never recoup. It's a lie. Of course the bands never recoup, but in the process of never recouping, the labels make a lot of money. Because, in very simple terms, for every £1 that the band might have got for a CD sale, which they're paying back their debt for, the label was taking £3 or £4. So the band could be still £50,000 in debt, and the label could be £300,000 up on the deal. So when record labels say, half our bands never recoup, as if this is like we lose money. No, they don't lose money. So when the income stream for equitable remuneration came in, it was a real lifeline. It was something that performers could guarantee they would get. And PPL have done a fantastic job. And this is something that has kept our industry alive, I think, because otherwise people would have got wise a long time ago and said, there's no money in this, I'm going to get out. So as far as I'm concerned, and I've said it many times, and you may have read me saying this, but equitable remuneration is the jewel in the crown of performers' rights. Exclusive rights will be swept up by the record label. And that's whether you're a featured artist or a not-featured artist, I'm afraid. When session musicians sign their consent form, exclusive rights all swept up. Believe me, if the record label could sweep up the equitable remuneration right as well and use that against recoupment, they would. This is a fantastic source of income. We need to make sure that streaming and whatever follows it provides an equitable remuneration source of income. And I stop short of saying a source of income, because I honestly believe it should be just simply a source of income right now. We shouldn't have to change the rights regime. But we need to make sure that happens, or it will only be people with independent incomes from somewhere else, mum and dad or whatever, who are going to come into this business, because there won't be any money in it. Because as Fiona has already said, as people switch more and more to streaming services, they move away from radio. And so, the licensing income for collecting societies from broadcasters is going to go down. And we have to make sure that's replaced with something else. I'm going to talk about heritage acts at some point, but I'll wait for Keith to bring me in on that later on, if you like, because I've dominated for a while. This is essential. If we don't solve this problem now, we're looking at a very bleak industry in the future.
When I thought about this, and I thought about changing the system, I thought about how difficult it would be, Keith, and I was interested also in your view that it's simple. And by saying it's simple, sadly, I don't think makes it simple, because the reason we're in the position we are seems to me to be about a very embedded outlook on rights, particularly over the English Channel, our continental colleagues. So those of you who understand copyright will know that we, in the common law jurisdiction, so that's us really in the United Kingdom and our erstwhile colonials, so the United States, Canada, Australia, we have a common law type of copyright, where we tend to think of copyrights as all having more or less the same status and more or less the same value. In other words, the copyright in a song, certainly here in the UK, we treat as having more or less the same rights as the copyright in sound recording. Our continental friends take a very different view of this. Our continental friends don't think of copyright in a sound recording at all, actually. If any of you enjoy reading directives, European directives, you'll notice they talk about copyright and other subject matter. And this rather dismissive phrase is the phrase that our continental friends use for the rights in sound recordings, because they're not authors' rights. They don't think of them as true copyrights. They think of true copyrights as things made by individual people, so artists, writers, songwriters. And it's like a right embedded with a moral right. They think of neighbouring rights, which is the other word they use, as rights created by businesses, so film companies and record labels. They're not really true copyrights for our continental colleagues. So we, having joined the European Union, now suffer from a copyright regime, or a copyright and related rights regime on the continent, which is really antithetical to the way we think about copyright. And lo and behold, who joins the ranks of the related rights owners on the continent? Poor old performers. So record labels and performers are stuck on the outside, and that's why the rights of record labels and performers historically have been a long time catching up with the true copyrights as our continentals think of them. And this is also reflected in the treaties. The international treaties, particularly the WIPO treaties, really govern intellectual property law across the world, because most countries are signatories of them. And if we're going to change the law, Keith, we're going to have to, I suspect, go right back up to international treaty level. It's not something we can do locally, even nationally. I don't think we can even do it at a European level, actually, sadly, because of what's stated in the treaties. Now, bizarrely, the treaties aren't clear. We're talking here about the WIPO phonograms and Performers and Phonograms Treaty of 1996, which, and because I'm a lawyer, I've got a copy of the relevant phrases here, did grant the exclusive right of making available to performers, and also granted the exclusive right of making available to producers. So there we go. If it's an exclusive right, it's been granted. To take that right away, arguably, we'd have to go back up to international treaty level. Although, bizarrely, if you read behind the curtains of most treaties, you actually find that nobody could agree to anything, in fact. And plenty of the things that are written in treaties are a load of nonsense. In fact, they're completely contradictory. And there's actually an agreed statement, which is quite sort of nice, it's a nice sort of irony, really, an agreed statement concerning Article 15, in which all the parties to the treaty said, Article 15 does not represent a complete resolution of the level of rights of broadcasting and communication to the public that should be enjoyed by performers. Delegations were unable to achieve consensus on differing proposals, and so we'll have to leave the issue to future resolution. So on the one hand, we've got an obligation to implement a certain right. On the other hand, we've got a statement that basically they couldn't agree anything, and we'll revisit the issue later.